Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Um, I want to preface my talk by taking you to the fable about the blind man and the elephant. They all had to have a look at what they were seeing, and depending on where they were, they saw something different. So it's just for the one who was at the trunk, he saw a snake, and the one at the tail saw a rope, and the one at the ear saw a fan. And so just to link that to the plethora of research out there on dyslexia, it depends on the discipline from which the researcher is looking, the difference, how the perspective differs. So this talk is about my perspective, and to give you a little bit more insight into that. I've always been a very reserved about labeling children as dyslexic because it is a lifelong condition, and children tend to cop out when they hear that they're dyslexic in terms of the effort and motivation to learn to read. So bear with me in terms of that. So to start with, we will look at an overview in terms of watching a video on dyslexia, and then we'll unpack it a little bit more by looking at what reading entails, what dyslexia is, how we can assess it and reach consensus on a diagnosis, and what intervention and accommodations we can use to support the learner with dyslexia.
I am sure that you've heard the old adage that reading is fundamental, but have you taken time to contemplate how reliant we are on reading? Just imagine trying to get health care for a loved one if you couldn't read. There are tons of forms. Then you have to read up on the medical condition. If you get a prescription, you have to read what it is, when to take it, and how much. This is kind of important stuff. And given that this is a big deal, you're probably not surprised that reading is linked to health outcomes. Reading is truly a life skill that most of us take for granted. I mean, if you think about it, why shouldn't most of us? We learned how to read in school, and it's just something we picked up. It's something we could do. But this is not the reality for the people who struggle with reading due to dyslexia. Reading ability falls along a continuum. Some individuals are great superstar readers, while others are just average. But then there's people who are below average to well below average. Individuals with dyslexia fall towards the lower end of this continuum. Dyslexia is a brain-based type of learning disability that specifically impairs a person's ability to read. Dyslexia is characterized by difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. Decoding is our ability to sound out words to read them. Dyslexia is extremely prevalent and is the most common learning disability. The ability for all children to read is influenced by multiple factors that interact with one another to bring about reading success. One of these factors is motivation. With that said, dyslexia is not the result of a child being lazy or not trying hard enough. Children with dyslexia can work just as hard and even harder than the other kids in their class and still struggle to read. All of this effort will achieve little if these children are not provided with the appropriate instruction to address their needs. Environmental factors also impact reading achievement, and solid, core classroom reading instruction is critical for the success of all students. But dyslexia is not the result of poor core reading instruction. Don't get me wrong, our schools can be improved, but individuals with dyslexia can be found in even the best of schools. During the early grades, the majority of children respond to high-quality, direct reading instruction, but some kids do not respond to this high-quality instruction, and parents and teachers alike are left wondering why these kids are not learning to read. For many of these kids, the reason could be dyslexia, but there is hope for these individuals. Children and adults with dyslexia can learn to read when provided with appropriate instruction that addresses their educational needs. Individuals with dyslexia require direct, intensive, systematic, cumulative reading instruction. But why don't they respond to less intensive quality instruction like many other students? The answer is in part due to neurobiological differences observed in individuals with dyslexia. One of the risk factors is a family history of dyslexia, and it is well documented that dyslexia runs in families and has a genetic component. Our genes provide the blueprints for our brain, and dyslexia is a brain-based learning difference. My research and the research of many others provides a better understanding of this brain basis. Reading is supported by areas of the brain that allow us to produce and understand language. These language areas work with the visual centers and learning circuits of the brain to support reading development. This distributed network of brain regions allows a person to understand written language. Individuals with dyslexia show differences in areas of this distributed network. Differences can be seen in functional brain scans taken while individuals perform reading tasks. Differences are also seen on structural brain scans, and the wiring that connects the areas of the brain involved in reading differ between individuals with dyslexia and their typically developing peers. Another part of the answer to the question, what causes dyslexia, can be found in how we process language at a cognitive level in support of reading. But before we consider the cognitive components of dyslexia, we first need to consider the different components of reading. The ultimate goal of reading is to comprehend text. If comprehension does not occur, then a person has not read. But we can't comprehend a text if we do not have the skills needed to identify the words on the page. And we use our ability to understand spoken language to comprehend written language. Our ability to understand spoken language is supported by many skills, more than I can capture in a single figure. But to highlight a few, children need a wide vocabulary, background knowledge of the topic being discussed. They need to be aware of the meaning units within words, and they need to know how words are put together to form meaningful expressions. Children also need to be able to read print fluently. When reading aloud, they should be able to read quickly with expression. Fluent reading requires an ability to efficiently and accurately identify individual words. The identification of written words is supported by an ability to sound out individual words. This is the skill of decoding, and to identify words by sight word reading. Sounding out words to identify them is supported by knowing our letters, their formation, and the sounds that go with them in the language. Sounding out words is also supported by the ability to hear the internal structure of words and isolate the individual sound units that make up words. For example, there are 3 sound units in the word huff. F. Proficient readers are highly accurate in word reading and the skills that support reading words. Proficient readers are also highly efficient and automatic in word reading. And just as phonological awareness supports the development of accurate word reading that is needed to allow students to develop proficient word reading skills, rapid automatized naming supports the speed by which a person can read words. Pulling a word from memory or effortlessly decoding a word is supported by our ability to efficiently go from print to sound, to go from seeing something to being able to access its name. So now let's turn back to the cognitive basis of dyslexia for many individuals. Remember, dyslexia is characterized by underachievement in accurate and/or fluent word reading. Individuals with dyslexia also often struggle with sounding out and reading words. But why is it that a child can have such a selective deficit in areas of written language? The reading deficits of individuals with dyslexia often stem from a problem with processing the sound structure of language. These aspects of language are phonological awareness and rapid automatized naming. When these components are deficient, we commonly observe corresponding deficits in reading accuracy and fluency. Deficits in word reading ability give rise to an issue with comprehending text. And learning new vocabulary, we often forget that most of the vocabulary that we learn comes from reading. It isn't possible to directly teach all the vocabulary necessary to support language development and listening and reading comprehension. So students who struggle with word-level reading skills often lag behind their peers in learning new vocabulary. Notice that I've not mentioned that dyslexia is a generalized learning disability. Well, because it's not. I've not said that these kids are dumb or lazy, because that's not true. They're not throwaway kids or adults. These individuals have a very selective deficit that limits their ability to learn how to read. And they need more intensive, direct, systematic reading instruction than others. But when they receive this instruction, they will learn how to read.
Now we can all go home. So just to continue and unpack it further, I want to show you this graphic by Dr. Hollis Scarborough's reading row, where she mentions the same components that are needed, both the phonological awareness and the language comprehension that goes along with learning to read. And although these are all individual strands that make up the fiber of the rope, and as you become more proficient, these become tighter and wound tighter and tighter to make up proficient reading. So that by the time you reach adulthood and you become you're a more skilled reader, you then know all these components and they're more automatic. In order to look into it a little bit more in depth, we're looking at reading and what is reading. So it's a real workout for the brain, and you need to be able to do these steps all at once. You understand the speech sounds, how they make up words. You focus on the printed marks. You connect speech sounds to letters. You blend the sounds smoothly. Your eye has to move across, so that's the saccadic movement of the eyes. You build images and ideas, and that's in terms of the video in your brain that helps you understand what you're reading. And then you compare this because you've activated background knowledge. So depending on whether you're reading something familiar, it would be easier to understand. And if you're reading something unfamiliar, you're still trying to link it to make connections to what you already know. And then you have to store the ideas in memory. So it's not as easy as it looks. Characteristics of good readers: they're able to read quickly. They read as fast as they speak, which is roughly 150 to 200 words a minute. They can read new words quickly. If you just go look at that, it's in terms of their vocabulary, or the sight word recognition is between 30,000 and 70,000 words. And the thing about poor readers is that they have that number or that deficit in their reading. So it's important for adults to be able to read with the children, because then it helps the language develop better and grows that vocabulary and allows them the richness thereof. Good readers don't forget the words they learn, and even after 4 exposures by 2nd grade, they know the words already. So poor readers don't do this as readily. Good readers use strategies, repair strategies, when they don't know what they've read. So for instance, if they've read a line and they didn't understand it, they would naturally go back and reread, or use a dictionary to help in terms of finding out what the word is, or ask an adult. Poor readers, on the other hand, don't readily use these strategies and have to be reminded. These strategies then have to be explicitly taught and made to give the child a lot of practice in there, so that they become more au fait with the strategy and use it more readily. The research has shown that you need to use and hear something at least 6 or 7 times before you begin to implement it. So poor readers particularly fall down at the phonemic level, or the phonological awareness level, in terms of their decoding ability. And that we'll look at that a little bit more closely. We've got just another view of the reading skills. And this is the area that we focus on particular, so the phonological awareness and the phonemic awareness when teaching reading. Because that's the area that shows up as a deficit in children characterized with dyslexia or labeled as dyslexic. So for the mechanics of decoding, you've got the umbrella term of phonological awareness, and it starts with the sound symbol correspondence, which is links to the alphabetic principle, the names of the letters and the sounds that they make. Then the ability to look at words, to break it up into its disparate sounds and blend it together meaningfully. It then goes on to compound and multisyllabic words and whole words and syllables, and you're reading with more practice, you become more fluent. So let's look in terms of Professor Stanislas Dehaene. He's a cognitive neuroscientist in France, and he's known for his research at functional MRI level. So what they do is they wire children up and they look at how what happens in the brain when children learn to read. And this is a graphic. This is another graphic of the same information. So what happens is that the brain isn't necessarily wired to learn to read. And you can read more about that in Marianne Wolf's book, Proust and the Squid, The Science and History of Learning to Read. So the word enters the brain at the occipital level, and there's letter and pattern recognition. And this misplaces or displaces the area that was initially used for facial recognition. This has now been moved because of the neuroplasticity of the brain. All primates have that facial recognition area. That has now been moved to the right hemisphere. And when you are learning to read, you're establishing this neural circuitry in the brain. So it enters this, and Dehaene calls this the letterbox. It then goes to the front where it links to the language area, because what you're doing is you're mapping print to the oral language that you already have and making sense of it. So you recognize the sounds and the symbols, and then you make sense of it in terms of, oh, it sounds like the word bat or cat. And then you make meaning of it and store it in Wernicke's area, where you understand what you've written. And the more what you've read, and the more you do this, the easier it becomes. That's just another visual. So this is what they call the science of reading. And currently there's in the research what they call the reading wars, because the debate is about whether this is the correct way to teach reading. An interesting thing about what Dehaene says is we tend to think and divide learners learning to read into two camps. One is they read letter by letter, and the other is that they do whole word reading. And he's saying that there's none of that we all learn to read letter by letter. And as it becomes more automatic, you forget that the brain is actually picking it up letter by letter. And it's just that it's doing it at such a fast pace that it seems as though you're doing whole word reading. So Sally Shavitz, another researcher at the forefront of this type of reading, says that this is literally building the neural circuitry that links the sounds of spoken words to the print code. And well, David Kilpatrick, in his book for Equipped for Reading Success, says that it takes hundreds of exposures for this to become automatic. So just bear that in mind when we talk later about the intervention required. A little bit more about the phonemic awareness and what it entails. Phonological awareness is seen as the umbrella term, and that encompasses looking at the ability to detect rhyme or rhyming words, so cat, mat, fat, hat, the ability to break up and blend words meaningfully. So for instance, recognizing the letters in dog as d, a, g, and then putting it together as dog. And then deleting a phoneme. So for instance, if you say the word cramp and you take away the R, the word becomes camp. And as well as saying, recognizing the initial sounds in terms of alliteration. So that rhyme of she-sells, seashells. So when these skills are mastered, roughly in terms of typically children who are developing typically. We look at the awareness of a syllable level at grade 0 or thereabouts. The awareness of onset, which is the beginning, the initial sound of the word, and then the rhyme, the ending sound. So if you're looking at the word cat, the onset would be C, and then the rhyme would be the AT aspect. That is normally into first grade, and as they progress, they then become more au fait with longer words in terms of at the basic phoneme level and the advanced phoneme level. The low achieving readers, there would be a noticeable delay. So at the preschool stage, how does this show up as symptoms of children who are at risk for learning to read? They would have oral language delays. They would have directionality delays or confusion, so they wouldn't know left from right, or they wouldn't know the words before and after or between. They'd have difficulty with rhyming, and they would also have difficulty following instructions. So that's how it would present. Higher up, and it could be omitting words from text. It could be difficulty spelling, and it gradually becomes more and more tricky, and presents as oral, as metacognitive deficits in terms of being able to organize yourself and plan your work for children at high school and even into adulthood. There would always be difficulty in terms of learning to spell, or difficulty with spelling and difficulty with writing, expressing yourself in writing. So there was a question about how does this show up, and is my child's brain different? Yes, the dyslexic brain does differ. And according to Dahan, it shows up even in utero that already there's a difficulty or a difference in the brain. So it's not that there's anything wrong with the child, it's just that there's a glitch in the brain in terms of the development and the use of the areas to activate them. But given the premise is that given enough instruction, explicit, direct instruction, you can activate those areas and actually train them and create the neural circuitry required, which is why, even though you are dyslexic, you can still learn to read and become functional. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I just wanted to show with these slides the differences in the fMRI's images of the different brains. So there's a typical brain learning to read, and then the dyslexic brain, you can clearly see that those areas are missing. So there's a definite biological or physiological difference. Just a word about the costs is that it impacts on your ability to function within the world. And so if you are illiterate, you have less access, or you're less able to access information about hygiene, diet, or safety. You're also likely to suffer from poor physical and mental health. You have you're more prone to workplace accidents, misuse of medication. Your likelihood of becoming prone to or moving towards crime is higher. So it does have, and I think this was from the World Health Organization, about the impact of being illiterate. Now, the issue about defining dyslexia, the DSM-5 speaks of it as a neurodevelopmental or disorder. And by that, they mean that there's early onset and it's heritable, which means it's passed on in families. So you can inherit it from your mom or dad. It's a lifelong condition. And this is why I'm often cautious about saying this child is dyslexic. There's also a lot of diagnostic confusion around it because it's on a continuum, and it's so cutoff could be arbitrary. They say when you diagnose that it's important that you specify whether this is a mild, moderate, or severe case of dyslexia. And because it's comorbid with other disorders, and we'll look more at that in another slide, it's easy to label the child or any cases of poor reading as dyslexic. Again, there's diagnostic confusion. There's the cutoff could be, it doesn't say clearly whether there's no clear cutoff where you can say this group is dyslexic and this is non-dyslexic. What for me stood out was, and which makes me feel a bit more secure about doing it, is that once you've assessed, you can look at the score and a standard deviation of 1.5 below the mean. So if the mean is 100, a score of about 77 or 78 would provide more diagnostic certainty, which was really reassuring for me. So I've already said that. The prevalence, surprisingly, and it's just maybe because we're becoming more aware of how prevalent this could be, is that there's 1 in 5 children who are dyslexic. And that the shocking news is that at least 38% of our 4th grade students are below in terms of their reading achievement. So to look at the dyslexia in terms of being comorbid with other disorders, comorbid, for those of us who are not familiar with the term, is that it occurs with something else. So it could be part of or present with children with developmental language disorder. Here, the difficulty is that they have either expressive or receptive or both language difficulties in terms of expressing themselves. And so that could mask, that inability to express themselves could mask the dyslexia and hide it. So it makes it difficult then to diagnose whether this child is dyslexic or whether it is actually just linked to the language. It can also be seen with dysgraphia, which is the inability to express yourself in writing. It could also reflect as poor handwriting skills. It could be the dysorthography is just poor spelling. The dyscalculia is maths issues. Children with dyscalculia may have difficulty doing basic calculations, and yet they can understand more complex maths concepts. Children on the spectrum, children with anxiety or depression, and even those with ADHD could also be dyslexic. What do we do about assessment? In order to get a diagnosis, we normally have a psychologist or a qualified reading therapist assess the child, and someone you trust who's qualified enough to be able to make that diagnosis. We also, pediatricians are normally quite clued up on the symptoms of dyslexia and can guide you and help you along those lines. The reason I've put up our assessment battery is just to say that at Crossroads, this is what we use. And I'm proud of it because it's mentioned in the research. It's also in line with the requirements by the IEB and the GDE to assess whether the children need concessions. The CTOP is normally administered by the SALT, but the learning support therapists can also do that. And that's the comprehensive test of phonologic processing. So we look at words in isolation, and then we look at it in terms of your ability to decode. So that's the test of word reading efficiency, and that's a time test. We then look at words reading in context, and we look at independent reading ability. We look at the child's ability to spell, to express themselves in writing. So this is in isolation, the spelling in isolation and the spelling in context. And we look at their maths proficiency. If there's still more uncertainty, we then look at the CTOP, which looks at the phonological processing more closely. Essentially, you're looking at their phonological awareness. Can they name the letter? Can they write it? Can they produce the sound in order to decode? So decoding and encoding the word. And then what to do about it. All I can say is that I'm not going to go into much detail about how to teach, but just to mention that teaching then should be direct. It should be systematic. So you follow a specific program like the Autumn Gillingham or the Regal, which would increase the children's awareness at the phonological level and allow them to automatize the knowledge they need to decode, break up, and blend words when reading. It should be explicit, it should be cumulative, so it's always building on what they already know. And last of all, it should provide opportunities for overlearning, because you want them to be automatic, or the knowledge to be automatic. Now, just to recap or to go back on the definition, there is consensus now that dyslexia is a phonological awareness deficit. And often when there is evidence that there's a deficit with rapid automatized naming, then they speak of it as a double deficit. And this is the reason we focus explicitly on developing the phonological awareness, so that they can acquire that automaticity. So we look at developing your ability to decode so that we can then build on it. Practice will allow you to become more fluent, and then in conjunction with that, your comprehension will develop, obviously with a guide under the mediation and scaffolding provided by the learning support therapist or the reading teacher, because it's not just going to happen on its own. As Professor Dahan says, teaching letter sound correspondence is essential. It's the fastest way to acquire the reading and the comprehension, and you get to a stage where self-teaching can occur because you've drilled and provided drill and practice for those letters and sounds to develop. Just a word about practice. Research shows that it increases the neurological connections, insulating the myelin sheath, which then makes the brain more efficient and allows for the development of higher order thinking. So that's why the practice is important, and with the emphasis on getting the knowledge automatic, because you want that rapid automatized naming to occur. To give you an example, if I say to the children, what does automatic mean? And you say to them, I say, like, say your name. They don't have to think about it because it is automatic. So retrieval is almost instantaneous, and it goes to long-term memory and is pulled from there rather than coming from working memory. Now, you might say accommodations are unfair, but it levels the playing field. So some of the things that you can do for the children who are labeled as dyslexic is to provide extra time so that they can do it, because that retrieval of the information is a lot slower. They're not as fluent. Remember, the issues are phonological awareness and issues with fluency, and then with comprehension. So you want them to get a reader and a scribe, or reader or a scribe. You can use a speech-to-text and text-to-speech apps. You can provide a spelling accommodation in that you're not marking spelling as strictly, or you're not marking spelling at all, depending on the severity. You can provide graphic organizers. If you're doing a presentation, a good idea might be to print your notes so that they don't have to actually copy anything or take notes while they're listening. They can just annotate the presentation. Use a reading strip or a number chart. Use assistive technology like highlighters or enlarging the print. Keep the instructional time short because you don't want to overload their memories, and provide practice to allow for overlearning. Keep your instructions simple, so give one at a time rather than multiple instructions. Preview and review the work, and then use a multi-sensory approach. Also make them aware of time so that they become aware of elapsed time, because that's an important skill, even in adulthood. And that is it. So just to leave you with this quote from Marianne Wolf, the single most important implication of research in dyslexia is not ensuring that we don't derail the development of a future Leonardo or Edison. It is making sure that we do not miss the potential of any child. Not all children with dyslexia have extraordinary talents, but every one of them has a unique potential that all too often goes unrealized because we don't know how to tap it. Thank you.